Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the Center for Optimizing Rural Health October webinar, Effective Grant Writing for Rural Hospitals. My name is Cassidy Avila, and I will be the moderator today. And we're very pleased to have you with us. We have two esteemed individuals with a vast amount of grant writing experience in the rural world. So I'm really excited to turn it over to them in just a moment. But before we do that, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and we will make it available to you on our website as well as an email that gets mailed out after this webinar. And we have a few announcements at the end of the webinar. We will also be allowing the Q&A time. So if you have questions, these ladies are really excellent resources, so you can go ahead and type your questions into the chat as you think of them, or you can hold them for the end of the webinar. If you would like to ask your question, just let us know in the chat and we're happy to unmute you. We will not be unmuting everyone, so we'll have to unmute you individually. But let us know and we're happy to do that. So now I will turn it over to Lene Hutchison, and she will do a couple of introductions before we get going.
Good afternoon. My name is Lene Hutchison, and I am pleased to join you today on today's webinar. I am the director of the research office at the Texas A&M College of Nursing. Prior to joining the College of Nursing, I worked at the School of Rural Public Health, or School of Public Health at Texas A&M for over 13 years. And during my time at Texas A&M, I have been involved in various different capacities in probably over 1,000 proposal submissions, as well as being part of a project team working on a number of funded projects, including Rural Healthy People 2010 and Rural Healthy People 2020. At this point, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Janet Helduser, to introduce herself.
Okay. I'm Janet Helduser, and for the last 10 years, I've served as a program manager at the School of Public Health at Texas A&M, facilitating grant submissions and managing funded projects. I've also been at 3 other academic institutions in Texas doing the same, including a stint as director of a research institute that was strictly foundation and donor funded.
Thank you, Janet. So today's presentation will focus on really 5 areas of interest to every grant writer. These are the focus areas that address the perennial questions that, as a grant writer, you often encounter, beginning with how do you get noticed from the crowd? What does it mean to be responsive? Interpreting what funders are looking for, the level of sophistication that's required or expected in order to submit a competitive proposal, and what are some of the best practices for effective grant writing, particularly for rural-focused proposals. So the question is, where do I even start? I think it's a question that we all grapple with. So really the first question begins with the type of project. Depending on the type of project, this often signals the type of funder that would be interested in your particular project. The questions we ask ourselves are, is it research? Is it more programmatic? Is it a planning grant? Is it implementation? Research projects generally are funded by federal grantors, such as NIH and CDC. Programmatic planning and implementation grants are often under the purview of private and federal, such as HRSA, Health Resources and Service Administration, USDA, CDC, but also many community and private philanthropic organizations. In order to understand really what the funder is looking for, the type of project, it's important to read the request for proposals or request for applications thoroughly, and Janet will speak more to that in a minute, to really understand what the sponsor is looking for. And then, of course, there are a variety of funding opportunities at the federal, state, regional, community, and private and philanthropic and corporate foundations. The challenge really is finding the right fit. So the question is, what is meant by the right fit? Our natural inclination is, once we have a really great idea, is we want to immediately jump into searching for an opportunity. But in fact, the first step is really thinking about the question, or at least brainstorming ideas in search terms. We often think of a project in very narrow terms, but consider how the project might be couched or presented in much broader terms to appeal to a wide variety of funders. For example, you might be interested in expanding EMS services, but consider how the project might be presented. Possible ideas for expansion include first responders, rural response, increasing capacity, rural network development, improving access to care, etc. Also, in terms of searching, be sure and keep track of your search terms in any sort of Boolean logic. The ands and the ors are important. It will be helpful for you to keep track of these so that you can be as efficient as possible in your searching. In terms of funding, there are a wide variety of search engines and listservs that are quite helpful in the search process, and we'll talk more about those. But also the program officer. The program officer or contact person is an excellent resource for you in terms of learning more about the funding opportunity. I would caution you, though, to be careful because generally it's allowable to contact the program officer, but for certain funders, sometimes state funders, they do have limitations on when you can contact the program officer. There may be a window of time that contact is allowed. So in terms of federal funding, the most comprehensive resource is grants.gov. And in it consists, it's a comprehensive search engine of federal funding opportunities. The site is robust and allows you to search for a variety of key filters such as keywords, funders, and also by status. Not only does it allow you to look for open calls for proposals, but also forthcoming calls. It also allows you to search closed opportunities, which initially you may not think is important, but most calls, federal calls, are cyclical, and it gives you an opportunity to review the proposal or the call for proposals that have been issued in the past. Also, I would recommend joining their listserv, which is very good, and tailor the types of funding announcements that you would like to receive, and also the timing of those. You may want to receive those on a weekly basis or a monthly basis based on those search terms. You probably don't want to receive those daily because we all receive plenty of emails. Also, if you find a funding announcement that you're interested in, you can subscribe to that funding announcement, and then you will receive updates when it's been posted, or importantly, if there have been any changes to the requirements and also changes to the due date, which occasionally that does happen. So we talked about federal funding. Other sources of funding are your state offices, in particular the Department of State Health Services. In Texas, our Department of State Health Services has a very nice website in terms of providing a variety of funding opportunities. But also they have a listserv that's available to subscribe to. The weekly digest includes not only federal funding opportunities, but also private foundation funding as well. Another excellent resource, which I'm sure you're probably already well aware of, is Rural Health Information Hub, RHI Hub. It's an excellent resource for you to search for funding by topic and also by region. You can also subscribe to their weekly updates to receive information about rural health funding opportunities and also webinars. So in terms of where to start, it's often important to develop a profile of your particular state or region. And one wonderful resource is the Grantsmanship Center. And what I like about the Grantsmanship Center is it allows you to drill down into your particular state, and it shows you the top funding opportunities or top funders by foundation, government, and corporate funding. It really gives you a profile of who is funding what in your particular state. In terms of private foundations, there is I knew I was going to not say Philanthropy News. It is available on the website I've listed. And what's nice about it, it also allows you to search by particular search terms and also regions. Another resource is the Foundation Directory. It's also a robust research foundation listing of foundations, but it does require a subscription, so there's a fee involved. In terms of funding, also consider any local sort of possible sponsorship, industries, philanthropic organizations. Often, if you have perhaps some chains in the area, such as H-E-B or Walmart or Walgreens, they often have a philanthropic arm also, so it's another opportunity to look for funding opportunities. Finally, while your organization may not be eligible necessarily, there are always opportunities to collaborate with other partners who might be eligible, such as local schools or faith-based organizations. Another suggestion for looking for funding is the fact that great minds often think alike. And so your particular idea may be one that another region or another state has considered pursuing in the past, or they've successfully pursued. The Federal Reporter is a site that allows you to search for funded projects by state, by region, by search terms. So it might provide some valuable information in terms of what types of projects have been funded in the past and who has funded them. So in thinking about grant writing, one of the first questions is, or should be, what is the funder's perspective? And so what do we mean by that? Particularly when you think, well, my idea is great, and who would not want to fund it? It's really all about alignment. Foremost, we want to do our due diligence to make sure that we understand the funder's mission and that we understand their priorities. While we may have a wonderful idea, it just may not be the right fit for that particular funder. Funders like us to use their language and to understand their mission. And part of that is driven by the fact or an understanding of the nature of foundations. Foundations answer to boards and are generally very risk averse. They live and work in the communities that they serve, and they're very much attuned to the projects to make sure that those projects have the highest likelihood of success. And often they have limited resources, and so they only select a handful of projects, and therefore they want to make sure that they fund the highest quality projects that are available. So now that we've identified a potential funder or potential sponsor, the next step is to determine or to look at responsiveness. Responsiveness is really the degree to which a proposal meets the funder's requirements. These are the thresholds to make it past that initial review of applications. The initial threshold includes, is it an on-time submission? Proposals that are submitted even a minute late are generally considered not allowable from a federal standpoint, and also from private foundations as well. Look at eligibility. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Responsiveness in terms of the format and the content. They have very particular requirements about the format and the content of the proposal, and Janet will speak more about those. Have we demonstrated sufficient capacity? Have you assured your funder that you really do have the resources and capacity to be able to complete the proposal successfully? Is the budget within the limits they've prescribed? And also look at the format itself. Is this an actual full submission, or are they just looking for a concept paper? Concept papers are much shorter, require less detail. So in terms of responsiveness, the initial question is, are you eligible? Often foundations and federal funders restrict the types of entities that may submit. For instance, they are looking for a nonprofit, a 501c3, or a particular type of service provider, perhaps a faith-based or education or a hospital. Also look at the type. Does the type of project match the funder's intent? For instance, there are often proposals or calls for applications that are looking for planning grants, but maybe you are proposing a program grant. So making sure that the type of program or project you propose matches what the funder is expecting and anticipating. Also look at the region. Oftentimes a funder, particularly a private funder, a community foundation, is really interested just in a particular area of the state, and look at those requirements in terms of the area covered. And then the question is, if you are not eligible, then what? Oftentimes, if you're not eligible, perhaps a partner is eligible. And then budget considerations. We will go into further detail in a few minutes, but in terms of responsiveness, the budget is a key requirement. Be sure that the budget is within the prescribed limits. Funders generally set a cap, and if there isn't a cap, then that's an opportunity to look at the funder's website. The foundations generally have a listing of all of the previously funded projects that you can look at to see whether or not your particular project is within that range. Also be attuned to language regarding leveraging, which is often presented as a match or cost sharing. For instance, the guidance may require a one-to-one match. It's important to recognize these additional commitments as you prepare your budget. And at this point, I will turn it over to Janet Hilduser.
Now we're going to address the application process. Just how sophisticated do we need to get with that application? And of course, that depends on the funding mechanism. As Lene has indicated, a foundation may only require something as simple as a 2-page letter of application, but they may also only accept applications that have been invited. So meeting, calling, or emailing with the foundation in advance to determine if your project is something they are even interested in is generally very helpful, and most foundations are very willing to do this. A federal grant, on the other hand, may be a very lengthy application with not only a specific RFA, request for applications, to respond to, but a separate rules and guidelines document like the SF-424. So step 1, read the request for applications, the program announcement, carefully. A yellow highlighter is your best friend. You'd like to underline the purpose, all required elements, the review criteria, and even the buzzwords that you'll want to be sure and include in your proposal. You might use the term low income quite a bit, but the funder may use underserved or low socioeconomic status. So be sure to mimic their language. Be sure also, as Lene suggested, to check and double check who is eligible to apply. Review the frequently asked questions first, especially if you're considering calling the funder's program officer with a question. And attend to review any online webinars or trainings that have been offered pertinent to that RFA or program announcement. The next thing we generally do is, working backwards from the application due date, develop a timeline for your submission, identifying clearly the responsible persons for each section of your application and the deadlines. A 12-week, which is 3 months or 90-day deadline, is about the minimum that I like to work with. Some larger collaborative grants that have multiple partners and perhaps subcontractors, would easily require 4 to 6 months of preparation time. But based on the review criteria in the RFA, you should also up front develop a scoring matrix or review rubric to ensure that all key elements are addressed. This will come in handy both while you're working and when you've completed the application and are reviewing it. Whether the application is simply a 1-page letter or a 32-page application, it is likely to follow this same general format, with the 4 basic elements being these. A first section on significance. Why is this important? What problem makes this so important? A second section on innovation. What exactly are you proposing, and why is it different than what everyone else has done before you? A third section, that is the approach, should really be the nitty-gritty of your project plan, the who, when, where, and how. I know that some of the negative comments I've received from reviewers before have been when I've shortchanged that how section in my proposal. And one way I try to avoid that now is by including graphic flowcharts to show that I've thought through from the very beginning to end exactly how that how is going to work. And a fourth section is likely something about outcomes. What can the funder expect as a result of this project? So now I'd like to expand on each of those 4 sections. The significance, it might be identified as the background, the introduction, the rationale, or the needs. Establishing significance is best done by backing up your own ideas with facts, and that can come from the published literature, or that can come from publicly available data sets. Some examples of public data sets that are often used in rural funding applications to, let's say, define the need in your target area could be the U.S. Census Bureau, your Department of State Health Services or Public Health Department. I use quite a bit the Texas Cancer Registry. The Rural Health Information Hub has an interactive tool called the Rural Data Explorer, and Robert Woods Johnson Foundation has community health rankings that can be used. I like to end that significance section. You can likely finish that with something like, therefore, based on all the needs that you've laid out. Therefore, the overall purpose of this proposed project is to X, Y, Z. And that would lead into your next section. But touching just a moment on that overall goal and your objectives, be sure to write those early on so that you have those as a template or sort of a guiding light in your process. Create those early. There'll be a tool as you establish your outline and a tool in your writing. It may even be helpful to develop a 2 to 3 sentence summary statement to describe your project, an elevator pitch, if you will, so that you can concisely share the information with anyone who's willing to listen. So the second major section of that application would be innovation, the it. What exactly are you proposing to do? We're struggling with a proposal right now that requires our it to also meet the requirements to be deemed a clinical trial, and are not quite sure if we fit that definition. But so be very careful about exactly what you want to do. Be sure that those goals and sub-goals, the objectives, are quantifiable. For example, objective 1 could be, objective 1 is to disseminate our diabetes intervention to 200 Tarrant County residents annually who are age 50 and older with a recent diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. Something very quantifiable like that. Describe how your project is unique and special, and tell the funder what you have in common with them and why this should be of interest to them. Relate your idea to their mission statement. You could even remind them of what they funded previously and similarly. For example, a statement like, this diabetes education project builds on the previous work of X Family Foundation, such as their 2016 funding of a diabetes education online tool that is now used nationwide. Something that says that you're familiar with what they funded previously and that you know that they're likely to have an interest in this work. And the third section we mentioned was the approach, also often called the project plan. That defines exactly the who, when, where, and the how. And elements of that could be the target area or the population clearly identified, the exact how-to, include the leadership and what their qualifications are, and justification for funding of any other personnel, such as, let's say you're asking for funding for a medical assistant. What will she be doing? Drawing A1C blood levels before and after a 12-week diabetes education program, something like that. And then many people do not, but it's always good if you have room to include alternate plans, or if some facet of the work does not work out, is there an alternative procedure that could be utilized? The fourth section of the application we talked about was generally something related to outcomes. It may have a different title, however, but what are the results and end products that the funder should expect to see or receive? Now, this last section then should include both a sustainability and an evaluation plan, and I'll define those in just a moment. It's also nice to conclude your application with some type of impact statement. For example, here's one. If each of the 200 people trained under this proposal disseminates this program to 20 more people annually, then this proposal has the potential to impact 80,000 people over 20 years. I think I did the math right on that, but a strong statement like that at the end can really enhance your proposal. So what is the sustainability and the evaluation plan? A sustainability plan will explain what happens after the grant period ends. How will you ensure continuity for the program? And no one wants to fund or start something that will simply be discontinued at the end of the funding cycle. If you don't have that clearly thought out, even if you're only able to say that additional funding sources and partnerships totaling X number of dollars will be sought during the project period, so that they know that you're at least thinking about how you will be able to fund this after the end of the cycle. An evaluation plan, on the other hand, it generally includes a description of the variables that will be measured to determine the success or failure of the project. For example, if you're going to draw A1C levels before and after the 12-week diabetes education program. A good evaluation plan also describes how you will be accountable to the funder. That can be in terms of reporting. Perhaps you promise to provide quarterly updates to the funder, or bi-monthly conference calls, conduct one annual report, and conduct one national webinar. You're including 2 rising scholars in your program. You know, things like that that they will look at to determine if indeed you have been accountable to the funder for those items promised. Some helpful hints and add-ons. Well, most applications, as you describe your target area, you know, everyone loves a good map. It presents the information in such a concise manner, and graphic presentations like this are so easy for your reviewer. So for example, in this map, the yellow triangle, and that should be in the legend, identifies our clinical partner. And the pink counties identify the area where we are currently providing clinical services, and we hope to continue as a result of the funding we're requesting. The maroon counties are those counties that we hope to expand to with our clinical services as funding is received. So this sure saves a lot of words and a lot of text to provide clear maps. They're always a good tool to use. Another tool are tables and figures to provide a concise overview. Now this table looks pretty cumbersome, but it was a big application. It would normally take about a half page, and I think this was a 12-page application. However, all the information then is presented in this table for those reviewers that really want to look at more detail. This is related to the map you just saw, so the only thing left that I would have to put into the text then would be a summary of, or point out a few things on this table. For example, of the 17 counties that we intend to serve, X number are rural and medically underserved, as noted in Table 1. X number have higher levels of poverty than the state and national average, and X number have higher breast cancer mortality rates than the state or national average. So here we've established quite a bit of need for funds for breast cancer prevention. Another element to include logic models or flow charts suggests that your project is well thought through from beginning to end. So a nice flow chart can really be an asset. Logic models are a little bit more extensive and would show inputs and then short-term outputs and long-term outputs as well. That can be very useful too, to summarize your material. Letters of support are often required elements of an application, and letters of support can provide evidence of cost sharing. Then they're normally called letters of commitment rather than just general support, but they can explain how you're going to leverage already existing resources. They can establish buy-in from your senior-most leadership. They can demonstrate true ongoing partnerships that have already done X, Y, and Z, and they can show community engagement and much more. Those letters of support should be on the organization's letterhead, and usually letters of support usually do not have to meet the same margin requirements required for the application, but that's something to check carefully in your RFA. Many of the longer applications do require an abstract or a summary. The abstract may be the last thing that you actually write once your proposal is complete. The RFA will indicate whether you need an abstract and specifically how long it should be, 300 words, 20 lines, 1 page, 500 characters, you know, something like that. Although it's likely the last thing you'll write, it is likely the first thing the reviewer will read, and it needs to be a concise mini version of your proposal, following generally the format that we've described. And some hints for things to check twice. This list includes things to pay special attention to after all of your hard work. Would be extremely disappointing to be disqualified without review for one of these technicalities. These are close calls that I've had, but thank you to Lene for always being my Q&A. An additional set of eyes, we've never had a disqualification without review. But this is another reason to read thoroughly and highlight that RFA. So what are the maximum page numbers that are allowed? That's important. And when you save your, let's say, 12-page proposal, your Word document as a PDF, be sure that that PDF doesn't create a 13th page that you'll need to go in and delete then. What are the fonts allowed? Times, 12, Calibra, does it have to be 12 or 11, Arial? Those are the most common ones, but look carefully at the RFA. And what are the margins required? Be careful when you insert your tables and figures, your graphics into your draft. Sometimes those will float over into the margins and go unobserved, and that could disqualify you as well. And saving as a PDF, also sometimes they float a little bit, so do be careful of that. Be sure you know exactly how many letters of support are allowed in your application. You'll also want to make a good first impression by checking your spelling and grammar carefully. And the best advice we can offer is to have some in-house reviewers. Maybe not only somebody who is an expert in the area, but also someone with no knowledge of your subject matter that can give you feedback on whether or not you've explained everything so clearly that even a non-expert can understand it. So hints for standing out from all of the other applications. It's not scented paper or purple ink, but here are 7 suggestions we came up with. Be sure that you state the purpose very early in your proposal. Letters of applications to foundations, those can even start with the purpose statement right as the very first line. I always start foundation letters that way. The purpose of this letter is to request X number of dollars to fund 500 XYZ annually for children living in Tarrant County. And that way, as they read the rest of the proposal, you've made it really easy on them. You've really defined what you're going to do. Use the funder's language. Depending on the type of application, you might also want to or need to limit the use of advanced medical terminology and acronyms. When I'm really needing to use a lot of acronyms because I need to cut space in an application, I'll do an acronym table as is shown on this slide and then put it at the very top of the, on the front page somewhere of the proposal. And the importance of describing your project as a joint mission of your organization and the funder really can't be overestimated. Support your argument with data. As we've discussed previously, there are many interactive and online public data sets available. Also, it's important to be concise. Don't be an overwriter. If you do tend to overwrite and just use a whole lot of extra words, then wait a few days and then go back and read your proposal simply for conciseness. What can I say in fewer words? And be sure also to update your website and social media. Even if these are not required elements and not supposed to be evaluated, the reviewer could be curious and subjectively be influenced by dated or poorly done social media. And our advice is to keep everything. You will likely get some kind of feedback or written reviewer comments back. And even or especially if you're not funded, these comments will be very helpful as you reformat and resubmit your proposal elsewhere. Lene, let's address budget.
So one of the wonderful things about working with Janet over the years is we've had the opportunity to tag team on many proposals where her emphasis was on the narrative. Mine has been more on the logistics and also the budgeting aspects of it. So in terms of budgeting, and we want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions at the end, but in terms of budget, there are really 3 elements of costs. There are the direct costs, the indirect costs, which go by many different names, and then the total cost. I would encourage you to look carefully at that section. It's one of the first sections we look at when we consider a potential proposal, because depending on the funder, they may set different caps. Some funders may cap the amount of direct costs, and others may cap the amount of total cost, which is the direct plus indirect. Just be careful that you do not inadvertently go over budget because of wording in the guidance regarding the type of cost that they are capping. In terms of asking or determining how much to request, it really comes down to your narrative. The budget should not live separately from the narrative. It's important that you are frequently touching base with the folks, or maybe it's you that's writing the narrative, to make sure that they align. Particularly as you get closer to the due date, often additional aspects are added to the narrative, and it's important that the budget and the narrative continue to align, because if your narrative includes an activity and your budget does not include it, it's going to be very apparent to the reviewer that at some point the two became out of sync. So really pay attention to the narrative and the logic model as a final check to make sure that you've captured all the costs. So in terms of cost or budgeting, there are really three sections. There's a detailed budget, which is what you think of, the Excel budget. There's the budget narrative, and then there's evidence of any leveraging or cost sharing. Under the detailed budget, generally most proposals have these elements. They have personnel, which includes your salaries and fringes, any material supplies, travel, programmatic costs, equipment costs, and then of course overhead. As I mentioned, overhead is presented often as overhead or indirect. At the university, we call it F&A, or facility and administrative costs. But regardless of what you call it, you have to be careful that you do not exceed whatever is allowed by the funder. Federal funders generally will allow your negotiated rate. Private funders generally have their own set rate, which may be quite a bit less than your standard rate. So it's important to think about what does that mean, what does that have, that has implications for your organization as well. If you do not have a negotiated rate for federal funders, you can request what's called a de minimis rate, which is 10%. The budget justification is the second part of your budget, and it's really the narrative portion. This is your opportunity to explain everything that's been requested in your budget. You want to be very thorough with the description, because you do not want the funder or the sponsor or the reviewer having to back into those calculations. You want to delineate each cost so that it's apparent how you came up with that calculation. It's also your opportunity to discuss any cost sharing or leveraging that you've included. Below is just a quick example of perhaps something you might encounter. If you're looking for a funder that potentially might be interested in a project where you're trying to develop a program in which you're providing healthy food options to a local cafeteria. In this case, the funder, the guidance says they will allow materials and equipment, but no personnel or facilities. So the question is this something that you should pursue? Potential answers are, keep looking. This is not the right funder. Submit, or just don't address those other costs, and then or submit and demonstrate evidence of leveraging. So the answers really might be potentially A or C. It's important to think about your overall cost, and if it really is a project or proposal that does not fit with your organization, it may be time to cut your losses and look for another opportunity. We would caution you against submitting a proposal in which you've not addressed those other costs, those costs that are not allowed, because funders generally, we don't want them to assume or presume how you plan to cover those costs. The third option, C, is probably the best answer. We would submit and demonstrate evidence of leveraging or cost sharing. Common limitations to look for, and again, reading the RFA, they generally include these, but there may be limitations on salary. They may not allow salary at all, or they may limit personnel to a certain percentage of the total. Generally, funders do not necessarily like a proposal that is entirely personnel. They like activities that are reaching out to the community. But each RFA is different, so look at those carefully. Equipment may or may not be allowed, and again, the issue of overhead. Federal allows a negotiated rate, and non-federal private generally set their own rate. The other question is what happens when it's funded? How important is that budget that you initially submitted? It really depends. Generally, with federal funders, you are allowed to rebudget up to 25%. With private foundations, private funding, they tend to be much more restrictive, and so they may limit that to 10% of your budget for rebudgeting, or they may require that every change requires their advance approval. The award will indicate that. It's very important to identify a program manager, a coordinator, or a liaison, someone who is the point person that's able to basically monitor the activities and also monitor the budget. And then finally, the question is, what happens at closeout? Unspent funds, if it's cost reimbursable, any unspent funds go back to the funder. If it's fixed price, then you may have the opportunity to keep some of that up to certain limits. If you are coming to the end of a project year that's multi-year, you can ask for carry forward funds and use those funds in the subsequent year, or you can ask for a no-cost extension in which you do not receive additional funds, but you are allowed more time to work on the project and you'll have access to the funds. So just a quick note on how do you actually submit, what are the logistics? It's again, we're reiterating, develop a timeline. Plan to submit at least a week in advance if you can. I know that is ambitious, but we really do try to do that. In terms of registration, if you've not submitted to a federal funder before, they have a rather involved process of registering your organization. That process can take a number of weeks because it goes through multiple systems. For instance, federal funders use ERA Commons, and they also use SAM registration and grants.gov. So as you're thinking of your timeline, if you've never submitted to a federal funder, those initial registrations can take quite a bit of time. The good news is once you've gone through that process, then you are officially registered and you don't have to do that again. Private funders generally have their own unique online systems. And again, you will want to go into their system, register, look through the online application and make sure that you understand all the requirements. Sometimes these applications have to route through multiple approvers at your organization, so you want to understand really not only the content, but the flow of the application. Also, if they have any particular, where you can subscribe to announcements related to the proposal, do so because often the due dates may change and also the requirements may change. Finally, as you're looking through the guidance, there are letters of intent that may or may not be required. Letters of intent basically are just that. They indicate whether or not you're planning to prepare a submission so that the funder has an idea of how many reviewers and the type of reviewers to assemble. Sometimes the letters of intent are binding, and they may say this letter of intent is due by a particular date, maybe 6 weeks before the actual due date, or it may be non-binding. If it's binding and you don't submit, then you're not eligible to submit the full application. If it's non-binding, then it's really a courtesy to the funder. So again, look at the language carefully. And also, we talked a little bit about this, but concept papers versus full submissions. Again, concept papers are much shorter, much more abbreviated versus the full submission. And I think we've come to the end of our slides. I think overall, I'm not speaking for Janet, but I would say that grant writing is both difficult work, but rewarding work.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, Janet and Lene. That was a really excellent presentation. So now I would like to open up the Q&A and see if we have any questions for either of you. Okay, so as I am checking the queue, this is your opportunity to go ahead and type any question that you have into the chat feature. You can also request to be unmuted, and I will find you and unmute you so that you can verbally ask your question. Okay. So the first question we have pertains to the mention of graphs. You had mentioned charts and graphs in the presentation. At what numbers should we limit these in our proposal?
This is Janet. I'm going to comment first and then let Lene make any additions. You know, it really depends on the length of the proposal. In a 12-page proposal, for example, I might like to have one something, table, figure, graph, on every other page. You know, in a 12-page proposal, I might think that 6 graphics would make it a little easier for the reader, but it's really going to depend on being responsive to their RFA. and how much information you've got to pack into that little amount of space. Lene?
Yes, I would definitely concur that, you always want to think about the reviewer and the reader. They are reading many, many proposals, and the extent to which you can provide some white space, a break in the reading, tables and graphs are nice. Like you mentioned, one or two, a map, included here and there are quite helpful. The other thing I would just mention and caution would be occasionally there may be the inclination to have some great data and want to put it into an appendices or attachment. And with federal funders, anything that you put into an attachment does not have to be read or reviewed by the reviewer. So I would not put anything critical to the proposal in an attachment. It really is supplementary.
Great, thank you. The next question that we have, and we have several people asking if we will make the slides available, and we will. We will share the slides and a recording of this webinar in a follow-up email that will come either today or tomorrow. So don't worry, you will be getting a copy of the slides. And the next question that we have is, I am not familiar with concept papers. Can you elaborate a little more on when you might do this rather than submit a proposal?
Many RFAs or program announcements will request a concept paper first, and then you would be invited to submit the full proposal. And I think that might offer some clarification. There would be separate deadlines for concept papers and for the full proposals, but only the concept papers that the funder was interested in would be invited to submit the full proposal.
Right, and I would say, for instance, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Corey Foundation, they both use the concept paper mechanism, and they will basically post that online saying that they're calling for concept papers. The nice thing with that, it really minimizes the amount of time that you've invested in a proposal, and also on the funder side, I mean, occasionally it's not that the idea is a bad one, it's just not the right fit. And so you'd much rather submit a 3-page concept paper and find out it's not the right fit than investing weeks and weeks and hours into a project that's really not something that they would potentially fund.
Thank you. The next question, how should an organization assess the number of FTEs required to successfully implement a sustainable grant writing program?
Lene has been Director of Research in both the College of Nursing at Texas A&M and the School of Public Health at Texas A&M. So I'm really going to turn that to you, Lene, to determine if you wanted to establish a grant writing office. How many FTEs would you? Right. In your dream office.
In my dream office. It depends on the needs of your individual organization. Generally, we have, at any given time, we have, 5 or 6 proposals in the queue. We submit over 100 proposals a year. And the grant writing office has different levels of involvement in that process. So you really, ideally, you would like that person who's an excellent grant writer who focuses on the narrative portion of it. But then also, you really want someone who is well versed in more of the budget aspects of grant writing, in terms of developing the budget, leveraging, working with the logistics of going through the registration, maybe working with all the other pieces of a proposal. The narrative is one piece of many that goes in. Mm-hmm. So it really depends on, I would say, the volume of, I think most people find themselves in the grant writing role because it's a second role that they've assumed, and then as you're successful, but it grows from there. But I can say that starting out, it's probably the most difficult phase because you don't have a lot of grant funding, and so you're applying much more often. Once you've established grant funding, then it becomes an issue of maintenance and grant management of the grants you have, but still keeping an eye to opportunities that are out there. So I know that I really didn't answer your question, but it really does depend on the nature of your organization.
In a small rural hospital setting, much of the grant writing might fall to someone who's acting as a development officer for that organization on a part-time basis, but it does sound, Lene, by what you've said, that they need to have a strong partnership with someone who can handle the budgeting, the financial deadlines, the registration, and those types of things that might be required.
And then in terms of the post-award side, which is where we want to be, where a project is funded, if your particular project or proposal allows, definitely trying to build in a project person. It's usually not a full-time person. It's a coordinator role. It's probably someone who has another title. But there's a lot of, obviously, management once it's been awarded that can be deferred to that individual person to make sure that all those activities are tracked and financial reporting is conducted and completed.
Thank you. Next question. I'm just getting started in the grant writing process. Do you have any educational suggestions for me? It sounds like maybe she's asking if we have any resources that we can direct her to get more education on the grant writing. And I will go ahead and say that at the Center for Optimizing Rural Health, we are implementing a grant writing course to come in January of 2020. So if you got this email, you will be getting more emails from us to let you know about that. But Lene, if you have some other resources, that would be great too.
There are a lot of different resources often available, for instance, through here in Texas, Department of State Health Services. They offer a number of grant writing courses as well. There are a number of private entities that offer grant writing courses. Those can be rather pricey at times. So in terms of, we live in a world that, we have a lot of educational opportunities online. So I would say it's sort of a combination of, and it's great to hear that the Corps will be offering this program as well. But looking at your state Office of Department of State Health Services and see what they might offer as well. Part of it is jumping in and being willing to, read the guidance and beginning that process of beginning to learn the process of it. I mean, it does take time. Folks that are effective have spent many years in that role. But I think ultimately, and I think Janet said best, if you're excited about the project, that will come through in your writing, or make sure it comes through in the writing, and funders will see that.
Great, thank you. And then Patricia is asking or stating, I assume concept paper requirements are provided by the grantor?
Yes, the concept paper, it looks like a regular application, but it will say it's a concept paper, and it has limitations on, it's basically a mini proposal. It's 2 or 3 pages, and often it doesn't have a budget. It may just have a total amount that you're requesting.
And then, Patricia, to follow up on the next statement that you made, would sharing the presentation be a good start to give rural hospital staff an idea on how to start the process? Yes, and you can share this presentation. The recording will be made available on our website as well as our YouTube channel. And one moment, we've got a glitch in the system, and I'm assuming you guys are still hearing me, but my screen, I show we're still recording. But anyway, yes, please do share the presentation, share it with your staff, and you're able to forward the email that we send you on to anyone else. I apologize, there was a technical glitch on my computer. But we do have more questions in the queue, so let's see what else we have. What would you recommend doing if the funder never replies to your proposal? I have submitted some and have followed up, but have received no response to my submission.
There are some funders where, we really, obviously, even unfunded proposals, we understand that happens, but we do receive some sort of summary statement. Federal funders provide a summary statement. Private foundations, it tends to vary. Some of them give no feedback at all, and others give a shortened a summary of their thoughts, feedback regarding a proposal. I would probably encourage you to follow up with them just to make sure your proposal was actually received. I don't know if it went in through an online system or occasionally. proposals are emailed still, and just making sure it was actually received. I will say that working with foundations, we really didn't touch on this, but part of that is in developing a relationship with them. I know with some of our funders, some of our foundations, we have invited them in or asked to meet with them personally, just to talk about, where are some areas that we can work together, where are some synergies. That goes a long way in terms of beginning to build that relationship.
I agree. I think so many foundations really only look at the submissions that have been invited. And so making initial contact with the foundation, expressing interest in learning more about their foundation, what they like to fund, introducing yourself and your programs to them is just a great way to ensure that before you make a submission, it's something that is of mutual interest to both.
Great, thank you. The next question in the queue, typically how long does it take to write a federal grant if you are the lone writer?
Well, we have the best case and worst case scenario. We have examples across the board. I will say that we have some writers that they basically have a plan for the year, and they know exactly that most, calls for proposals come out on a particular cycle. That here, look, we have some funders that they issue RFAs twice a year, 3 times a year, and so they develop a plan, and they develop a writing schedule. And so they may say that it's going to take them 3 months to submit a proposal. Then we have, and this happens a lot too, and it's not a bad thing, but often you may run across an opportunity or someone sends you the opportunity and it's due in a week. So really you have to look at the guidance itself and see how involved it is. I mean, ideally, you want to give yourself a couple of months to work on a proposal, a good, strong proposal. But, if it's a concept paper and you feel that you can respond to those more minimal requirements, then, maybe it is something that you can submit in a week. Janet?
The most complex proposal that Lene and I have worked on together was one that had 114 faculty involved. It was, huge and not applicable to this situation, except to say that we depended on other writers for their expert paragraphs. And so it does become more difficult sometimes the more writers you get involved. So sometimes it's more of an advantage to be the lone writer than to have to wait on individuals' expert paragraphs.
And I think what would also help in terms of being able to turn proposals around quickly is having sort of your boilerplate information together already. Most proposals have a section on facilities and resources and your organization and your history. Having that just available, then therefore you don't have to spend a lot of time preparing that for each one. You could just use that and update it slightly. Having budget templates ready to go so that you can plug in numbers. So that time can be spent on the actual narrative. And then also, working with your community and having those key contacts and I'll be honest, we go back to our key contacts, over and over again, so that as you build those relationships, when you approach them about a letter of support or commitment, it's much easier. Oftentimes those letters of support or commitment are ones that you've provided some verbiage for them to include. So a lot of the prep work you can have ready to go on the shelf so that when you see an opportunity, it's not quite as onerous to try and pull it together in a short amount of time.
Great, thank you. And we do have another question in the queue, but because it's straight up 2 more questions, 1 o'clock, I'm going to go ahead and make this quick announcement. And if you have the time, please stay on with us and we'll get to the last 2 questions. But I just wanted to let you know, as I said earlier, we will send a follow-up email. In that email, we will have a link to this recording and any resources that we might be able to point you to that you've requested. We will also send out a link for a 1-minute survey. So if you have 60 seconds, we would greatly appreciate your time, not only for feedback on today's webinar, but just to give us any suggestions for topics you would like to see in a future webinar. You are how we get our ideas, so we would love to hear from you. And a sincere thank you for being on the call and your excellent questions today. So if Janet and Lene, you don't mind, we've got a couple more questions and we'll just keep going, and we will not be offended if you have to jump off of the line. We know you're busy. Okay, so the next question is Jessica. Can you point us to resources to find grant writers in our areas that we can hire to assist us?
I would say maybe if there are local community organizations, I'm thinking here locally about United Way, and we have some other organizations that are similar. They have really professional grant writers that are available. Also, if there's a university that's near the your organization, you know, they might be able to provide some guidance as well. Gina?
I don't have anything additional to add. Yeah. You know, grant writers can be very expensive, and so the ideal situation would be to partner with someone, collaborator on that particular project that could offer that assistance.
And someone commented in the Everyone chat that she is a grant writer working for a rural hospital, and that was to Christy. So Christy, you specifically addressed that to Patricia. So if you guys don't mind, it sounds like you might want to make a connection. I will be happy to put you in contact after this webinar, and maybe just as you suggested, Janet, you can do some collaborating or sharing of resources. Our next question. Would it be feasible for a rural hospital to hire a professional grant writer, or perhaps a group of hospitals work together to formulate a project requesting funding for common issues they're all experiencing? In other words, collaborate.
It might not be a bad idea for a group of hospitals to work together to seek funding from a foundation for grant writing. You know, to establish a grant writing collaborative, let's say, and to pursue foundation funding for that. You know, that might be one way to get that off the ground. It's an excellent idea.
And just in general, collaborative projects, it's really, I would say, it's the majority of our submissions are collaborative in some way. No one individually has all the resources. I was thinking about a presentation a couple of months ago where a hospital was interested in introducing lean into their organization, but they actually did not have the resources to pursue it individually, and so it was actually a group of hospitals that went together and submitted a joint proposal to introduce lean into their organization. So yes, definitely any opportunities for collaboration are highly encouraged.
Great. Well, it looks like those are all the questions that we had in the queue. So we will go ahead and wrap up. But if you think of a question, please feel free to email it to us, and we'll do our best to get a response to you after the webinar. Thank you so much, Janet and Lene. We appreciate your expertise. You have some great tips and examples, and we look forward to having you again. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.